All right, Algebra 2, factoring and zeros of factors. So here's what we'll be working on here. We're going to find the zeros of these problems here. And let's just get started with this first one up top here. So remember that when you're finding zeros, right, that let's say you have two things that are being multiplied together, 5 and I guess 0. 5 times 0 equals 0, right? So what our goal here is that we're trying to get each of these factors equal to 0. Okay, and the reason why is, if I have this 2x plus 1 times 0, right, that equals 0. So what I'm trying to do is get each one of these factors equal to 0. So what we do is we take each one of these individual factors. Let's start with this first one, 2x plus 1, and we're going to put that equal to 0. Okay, solving for x, we get 2x equals negative 1. Okay, dividing both sides by 2, we get x equals negative 1/2. So if I plug this number here, negative 1/2, if I plug this number in here to this first factor, okay, if I plug in negative 1/2 here, it's going to zero this out. Okay, 2 times negative 1/2 is negative 1. Negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. So that means that this now equals 0. And 0 times anything, okay, 0 times this means this whole thing is going to zero out. Okay, this is the idea of zeroing out your factors. So we get our first answer as negative 1/2. All right, and we want to put this second factor in equal to 0. So we have x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, subtracting 1 from both sides, we have x equals negative 1. So if I plug this number here, negative 1, into this factor here will turn into a 0. And 0 times anything equals 0. Okay, so x equals negative 1 is another 0 for this problem that we have here. Okay, and finally here we have x minus 1 equals 0. Adding 1 to both sides, we have x equals 1. So here's our other 0. So we have negative 1/2, negative 1, and 1. Okay, these are the zeros for this function here. This function, this f of x. Okay, these numbers, each one of these is going to turn into a 0. This is the idea of zeroing out your functions. All right, let's move on to another problem. All right, here we have this x times 5x minus 2 times x squared plus 1. Now notice this x here, it's kind of all by itself. Okay, when you see this x all by itself, you automatically know that x equals 0 is going to be one of the zeros. So the reason why is if I have 0 times 5x minus 2 times x squared plus 1, when I have 0 times all this, okay, 0 times anything equals 0. So we can see that x equals 0 is going to be one of our zeros. So we have 0. All right, now let's find the 0 for this guy here. So we have 5x minus 2 equals 0. Okay, adding 2 to both sides, we have 5x equals 2. Now dividing both sides by 5, we have x equals 2/5. So if I plug in this number here, 2/5, if I plug it in here, 5 times 2/5 gives me a positive 2. Positive 2 minus 2 gives me a 0. So now this factor will be zeroed out. So we have this times 0 times this equals 0. So 2/5 will be another 0. And now let's find the 0 for this one, x squared plus 1. So we have x squared plus 1 equals 0. Okay, subtracting 1 from both sides, we have x squared equals negative 1. Now to solve this for x, I'm going to have to put a square root. Okay, I'm going to have to introduce a square root to both sides. Okay, see there was no square root there. I have to introduce this square root sign. Okay, when you introduce a square root sign, what it does is it cancels out the square root and the squared cancel out, so I have x by itself. But now I have to add this plus and minus. Okay, plus and minus negative 1. And that's because we introduced the square root. It wasn't there. So we introduced the square root. When you introduce the square root when you're solving, you have to add this plus and minus. Okay, add the plus and minus when you introduce the square root sign. So we have x equals plus or minus square root of negative 1. And perhaps you're aware of this, perhaps not, but if you have the square root of negative 1, okay, that equals I. That's your imaginary number. The reason why is you can't have a square root of a negative number. Think about it. If I have 2 times 2, okay, that equals 4. If I have negative 2 times negative 2, that also equals 4. Okay, but what two numbers can you multiply together that will give you a negative 1? They have to be the same number, right? You're taking the square root. So there's no numbers, nothing you could do here, okay, if you understand imaginary numbers. If you have a square root of a negative number, okay, that's an imaginary number. So we're going to say that the solution here, okay, is going to be x equals plus or minus I. Okay, that's your imaginary number, plus or minus I. So our zeros for this function, we're going to say is 0, 2/5, okay, and plus or minus I, we could say, just kind of write it like this, I and negative I. Okay, these are your zeros for this function here. Alright, next problem here, we have this guy here. So let's put this first one, x minus 3 equals 0. Adding 3 to both sides, we have x equals 3. So our first 0 will be the number 3. Next we have 3x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, subtracting 1 from both sides, we have 3x equals negative 1. Now dividing both sides by 3, we have x equals negative 1/3. So negative 1/3. It'll be another 0. And finally we have this x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, subtracting 1 from both sides, we have x equals negative 1. So here are our zeros for this function. Okay, if I plug in the number 3, if I plug it in here, this factor turns into a 0. Okay, if I plug in the number 3, this turns into a 0, and then 0 times anything, okay, the rest of this, all these are being multiplied together. So 0 times all this equals 0, so we're going to say 3 is a 0. Similarly, if I do this negative 1/3, okay, 3 times negative 1/3 gives you negative 1. Negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. Okay, turning this factor into a 0, which zeroes out the entire function. And same thing with this negative 1. Plugging in this negative 1 will do the same thing, turning this factor into a 0. Alright, and next problem we have here. So let's put this first factor to 0. We have 2x minus 1 equals 0. Okay, adding 1 to both sides, we have 2x equals 1. Now dividing both sides by 2, we have x equals 1/2. So our first 0 will be 1/2. Okay, next we have this x squared plus 3 equals 0. So subtracting 3 from both sides, we have x squared equals negative 3. Now once again, I have to introduce a square root sign to solve for x. See, it wasn't there. Okay, the square root wasn't there, but to get x by itself, I have to introduce a square root to both sides. Okay, that cancels out the square root and the square cancel out, leaving x by itself. But when I introduce a square root, I have to add this plus or minus. Okay, so plus or minus negative 3. So we know that negative 3, okay, we have x equals plus or minus negative 3. Let's look at square root of negative 3. Let's look at square root of negative 3. Okay, we could say that that equals the square root of negative 1 times 3. Okay, square root of negative 3 equals the square root of negative 1 times 3. Which means that I could take out this negative 1. Okay, so I could say that this equals I times the square root of 3. Okay, square root of negative 3 equals I times the square root of 3. But remember, we have this plus or minus. So we're going to say that it's going to be plus positive I times the square root of 3 and a negative I times the square root of 3. Okay, those are our next two zeros. I times the square root of 3 and negative I times the square root of 3. So let's move this up here. These will be our next two zeros. And finally, we want to zero out this factor here. So we have 2x squared minus 5 equals 0. Adding 5 to both sides, we have 2x squared equals 5. Okay, dividing both sides by 2, we have x squared equals 5 halves. Okay, and once again, we're going to introduce a square root sign. So that leaves x by itself on one side, plus or minus square root of 5 halves. Okay, and let's look at this plus or minus square root of 5 halves. Okay, plus or minus the square root of 5 halves. So, if we look at this here, let's kind of concentrate on just this square root. Okay, remember we have this plus or minus, just kind of ignoring that for now. So this is going to equal square root of 5 divided by the square root of 2. Okay, when you have this square root sign, okay, and a fraction, that this is kind of what it equals. Okay, you could represent it like this. So now we want to, what they do, they normally tell you is they don't like these radical signs in the denominator. Okay, this is called rationalizing your denominator. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply this by the number 1, represented as the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. Remember, anything times 1 remains itself. Okay, so we're not actually changing the value, we're just changing how it's being perceived. Okay, this here equals the number 1. Remember, anything divided by itself is 1. So you can multiply anything by 1 and it still remains the same. Okay, so what you have here is you have this, right? This, I'm going to say that this is kind of what we're doing here. So this is going to equal the square root of 5 times 2 over the square root of 2 times 2. Okay, that equals the square root of 10 over the square root of 4. And that's going to equal the square root of 10 over 2. Okay, so this x equals plus or minus square root of 5 halves. Okay, actually equals square root of 10 over 2. And remember that we have this plus or minus. Okay, we have that plus or minus. So what we need to do is add that plus or minus there. So we're going to say that this equals plus or minus square root of 10 over 2. All right, and here's our kind of our zeros that we have here. So we're going to add a positive square root of 10 over 2 and a negative square root of 10 over 2. And here are all our zeros. Okay, here's our zeros for this function. Here's our function. Here are all the zeros for it. All right, I just want to thank you for making it to the end of this short video on factoring zeros or zeroing out your factors. If you like these type of math videos, hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Thank you.